Hello friends, Buddy here at House of Props, and a few of you have asked me in the past to make Boromir's shield, and I finally managed to have the time to make it. I wanted to make it as authentic as possible, so I set about doing my deep research dive, and finding images of the front was no problem. There are so many of them available in the film and across the web. But the back turned out to be another story. It's barely seen in the film, and when it is in very low light, so I tried looking at Boromir toys and figures. This 10th scale figure from Iron Studios has the back create a concave surface, but from what I can tell from the film, the back looks flat, and both this sideshow figure and this Toy Biz figure have the rear as a flat surface. So that's what I decided to choose. The Iron Studios figure is great, don't get me wrong. I'm just not too sure how much Weta was involved in the design process. But I know they were heavily involved with Sideshow, and the Toy Biz figures came out around the time of the films and were meant to be highly accurate. Having chose this flat design, then created a new series of challenges. The front of the shield creates a convex curve and the rear is flat, so how to make the shield so it remains light out of EVA foam and keep it from getting too complicated with its curved and flat surfaces was the challenge. So let me show you how I managed to achieve this, and let's get started. To start, I cut part A 4 times out of 10mm foam. The reason for making this facing out of 4 pieces is simply because I didn't have a piece of 10mm foam big enough to cut the entire shield shape, and this is a way to not have a lot of the waste. To attach the pieces together, I apply a thin layer of contact cement to each edge and then use a heat gun to speed up the drying process. When using a heat gun like this, you don't want to dry out the contact cement too much or it won't stick together properly, and the same is true if it's left too wet. But I have found that using the heat gun to the point when the contact cement doesn't look wet anymore is the perfect spot to stop and then attach. I only attached 3 of the edges together. The 4th is where we will cut out a wedge in order to create the desired curve on the front, and this piece that gets removed is indicated on the template with a dotted line. With the wedge removed, these edges can be attached to each other. While I attach these, I would really appreciate it if you would click the subscribe button if you haven't already. It's completely free to you and will help this channel grow, and if you click the notification bell, you can get notified when new projects are released. Thank you. So with all the edges attached, this is how the front of the shield is looking. You can see there's a slight curve to the front, which is perfect. This is what we're looking for. Now we're going to give this some support in just a few, but first a 5-inch diameter circle can be cut out of the center. To give the shield some support, I cut part B out of some 1/8-inch Lauan, and I'll build up the texture with foam just like what I did with the Gondorian shield. The wood will act as support, and the foam will allow us to achieve the authentic textures without adding a ton of weight. Now, around the center where the grip and boss get attached, we want to glue part C around the center hole. This will align with the center hole in the top cover piece we just made, and it'll make the shield look like it's solid and not hollow. To attach this, I'm again using contact cement, because whenever I'm working with foam, I typically use contact cement unless I state otherwise. Now with that in place, I make a quick test fit to make sure things are aligning properly, which they are, which is great. So now we can add some supports to the shield so it'll hold its shape and not collapse in. To do that, I cut part D out of 10mm foam 12 times, and these are arranged around the center opening like the spokes on a wheel. And having these pieces like this will keep the shield light and support the facing so we can have the curve on the front and keep it flat on the back. With those glued in place, the facing can be glued on top. First, I align the center opening to make sure everything would be centered on the center point of the shield, and then lightly press the facing down onto the wedges. If you press too hard, you may end up with bowing or dipping on the top surface. Next, to make texturing easier later on, I'm skinning the Lauan with some 2mm foam. This will hide the roughness of the wood and allow us to create our own planking and wood grain later. To skin the wood, I apply the contact cement to both the wood and the foam and work on half of the shield at a time in order to make it a little easier. Then the foam can be pressed down and smoothed out by hand, and once flat, the center hole can be trimmed away. This way you don't have to worry about aligning around that little opening. I repeat the same process to the front as well, except I add 1 inch to the outer diameter so it can wrap over the edge. Then this piece can be glued down the same as the back piece, and this one will help hide the seams and the 10mm foam underneath. Now, if you were able to cut your 10mm foam from one piece, you may decide that this step is unnecessary. Next, part E can be glued onto the facing around the center boss opening. Now, this piece doesn't sit directly on the opening. You can see how the hole in part E is larger than the hole in the shield base. This is to create a ledge so the boss can sit into it and be supported. Part F's opening is the same as part E and can be aligned to it when gluing it down. You may have noticed that I use various colors of foam when I build. This is just something that helps me keep everything separate in my head and keeps me from losing or forgetting details. To make part G, aka the boss, I'm using a 5 1/4 inch glass dish lid I obtained from the thrift store. We will heat up the foam and press it into the lid in order to create the boss shape. And it just so happens that this lid is the correct profile needed for Boromir's shield. However, you could use a bowl just as easily. You just need something that is approximately 5 1/4 inches wide, has steep sides, and a relatively flat top, and it's probably best to avoid something that's plastic because since we're going to be working with warm foam, we don't want the plastic to warp in any way. Take some 6mm foam and heat one side with your heat gun set to high. When the foam is nice and warm but not scorched, flip it over and press the heated side into your receptacle. You want to really push and press the foam so the foam will stretch and take on the shape of your bowl or lid. Then let the foam cool before removing it from the mold. If you remove when the foam is still warm, you will lose detail and the desired shape. But once cooled, the foam will retain its new shape and the remaining foam can be cut away and the edge sanded to flatten it. Then the boss can be glued into the center of the shield and it should slip nicely into the channel created by parts E and F. To make sure the shield is durable and can withstand use, I made the handle out of a piece of 1/2 inch steel flat bar, and on either side I countersunk some screw holes so the screws will sit flush when attached. To this flat bar, I'm going to attach 2 pieces of part I, which have been cut from 10mm foam and have a channel carved into the back so the flat bar will sit nicely sandwiched between the two. Once attached, I sanded the edges to even out the surface. Then the grip can be attached to the rear of the shield. The grip sits at a slight angle and I removed the 2mm foam so the bar can be attached directly to the wood and the attachment can be hidden later on. Using a small drill bit on my rotary tool, I pre-drilled 2 holes for the screws in order to avoid the wood from potentially splitting. Then the flat bar can be attached in place with some small wood screws, and since the holes are countersunk, the screw heads sit nice and flat. Next, part J can be glued to cover the flat bar attachment, and since the screws have been sunk and the foam removed for the flat bar, this piece will sit flat and all signs of how the grip was attached will be hidden. Since I'm already working with metal, I decided to go ahead and make parts K out of some 70-75 aluminum sheet, which is 9/100 of an inch thick. By doing this, it'll add some more durability to the shield. These brackets will be used to attach the straps onto the back later on. I traced them onto the sheet with a Sharpie and proceeded to cut them out with a bandsaw. Aluminum is a soft metal, so if you have a saw which has a blade meant for metal, it should cut like butter. Once cut, I countersunk 2 screw holes like so. Now I just need to remove the area so the strap can slide through. To do that, I attach the brackets to a scrap piece of wood so I can have a better grip and drill out 5 holes along the indicated area. This removes a lot of the excess material so there'll be less to grind out. To grind, I use a cutting wheel on my Dremel. Then I switch to a smaller sanding disc to even out the openings so it's a rectangular shape and not all bumpy. Then I bend each piece so the side with the rectangle will sit higher on the shield, allowing the straps to pass through. Now I'm only going to attach one of these right now, and it's going on top of part J so that it sits at an angle like so compared to the grip. The second bracket will be attached a little later on once we have a few more pieces in place. Now back to the front. Around the boss there is a tubular piece, and for that I'm using some micro fuel line with an outer diameter of 3/16 of an inch that I managed to find at my local hardware store. This can be cut and glued where part F touches the boss. Next, the 2 part L's can be attached to the top of part F. Where they meet needs to be in line with the center line of the shield. So when figuring out the center line, make sure you take into account for the grip on the rear of the shield. And when you attach these wings, they need to sit snugly around the fuel line. I use a ballpoint pen to mark the wing details and placement of the 7 stars. To add detail to these wings, I'm using this tip on my wood burner. The stars are just for placement right now. We're just going to focus on the wings. So using the wood burner, I follow the line and lightly press into the foam. This will slightly melt the foam, causing it to look embossed. Now, these foams are toxic, so wear your PPE and work in a well-ventilated space. Follow each feather line and work on the center line side of each ballpoint line. Watch you don't stay on one spot too long or the foam may begin to burn like I did in this spot. It's not too bad and paint will cover that up. Since I have the wood burner out, I switched out the tip for a knife edge, and with this we can score some planking lines on the back of the shield. The knife will score the foam and the heat will cause the foam to shrink back slightly, which causes the line to open up and resemble wood planks. And since we're back here, I grab my Dremel and put on a small sanding drum. Using this tip and a light touch can give you a very subtle wood grain. Hold the tip of the Dremel so just the side top edge of the drum touches the foam, and by pressing down lightly you can create a very organic subtle line. Now to make these lines look like wood grain, you want to make them not straight, add some small broken up lines, and vary the amount of pressure you use. That way some are deeper than others. You can also create organic circle and spiral patterns, and these will resemble knots in the wood. Now, if you wanted to create a more pronounced wood grain, you can use the same technique, just add more pressure on the tip, so you create deeper and thicker lines. That's what I did when I made my Viking-inspired shield. You can see the technique is the same, but the results are deeper and look like a rougher wood texture. Next, part M is a 2 mm foam strip measuring 2¼ inches by 82 inches. This is going to create the metal banding around the outer edge of the shield, and to make installation easier, I first attach the middle of the strip to the outer edge with contact cement, and then bend over the front and glue it down. I added a line with a pen so I can keep an eye on the edge and make sure it stays straight as I go, and the same process can be repeated to the rear of the shield. After that, the second part H can be attached so it's diagonally opposite the first one like this. Again, you want to make sure you are referencing the center line of the shield when doing so. Next, I use part N to hide the screw heads on the brackets. These are 2 mm foam rivets I superglue on top of each Phillips screw head. Then an additional 11 ribbons can be glued around the center of part J. I mark the placement first, then squeeze a drop of superglue onto the dot, and then place a rivet on each drop. These are so small a drop is all that's needed, and that's why I'm using superglue instead of contact cement. Then 8 of part O can be glued onto the shield, 4 on the front and 4 on the back. 2 on each side are aligned so the point is directly on the center line, and the other 2 are halfway between those so that the points are 90 degrees from the first, measuring off of the center line of the shield. Then some more of the part N rivets can be glued on. Each part O gets 3 rivets, 1 on the point and 2 back towards part M. Next, I worked on the 7 stars. For that, I'm using some fabric puff paint and an upholstery needle. I squeeze some of the paint out and dip the needle in to collect the bead, and then apply the paint to the marked area. The reason I'm applying the paint in this manner is because the stars are meant to be very subtle detailing, and using the tip on the paint bottle wouldn't give the fineness needed, and using foam would look a little chunky. So I found using the needle like this allows me to push and pull the paint into the needed point and teardrop shapes to achieve the desired effect. Then some puff paint can be used to create the 32 large rivets on the banding. The front and the back each get 16, and since these are 3/16 of an inch diameter circles, the tips applied on the bottle should work fine. You could also use googly eyes for this step as well, then you don't have to worry about consistency like you would with squeezing out paint. When the puff paint has dried, I use some Quick Seal Plus to fill in the seams between the parts O and the part M strip. The caulk can be applied with a palette knife, and I'm really pressing the caulk in to make sure the seam gets filled. Then I dip my finger in some water and smooth out the caulk to avoid a lot more cleanup later on. The caulk will shrink slightly as it dries, so a second layer may be necessary, but it depends on how big of a seam it is. After it's dry, I lightly sand the areas with some 400 grit sandpaper. This will blend it into the foam surface and remove any fingerprints or lines left behind. You want to handle this step very carefully because if you press and sand too hard, it can rip up the caulk, creating ugly edges or even damage the EVA foam, so a light touch is crucial. Then I heat sealed the shield with the heat gun set to low. To avoid the foam melting or shrinking too much or unevenly, I made sure to keep the gun wafting back and forth the whole time, and this process will prepare the foam to receive paint better later on. With the shield build finished, we can build the straps. Parts P and Q are made from 4mm foam, but I'm currently out in the studio, so I'm going to make my own by gluing 2 layers of 2mm foam together. I'm not going to worry about the actual part shapes until after the strips are glued together. Then the parts P and Q can be cut out of the strips. Then parts R and S can be glued onto parts P and Q respectively. Parts R and S need to be centered evenly onto their corresponding shapes. And again, for the straps, I'm using contact cement for all the gluing. To punch the holes in part P, I'm using a 1/4 inch hole punch, which is typically used for paper. Just squeeze the foam in, make sure it's centered, and press, and it'll leave behind a perfect notch in the strap. Now, to make parts R and S look like embossed leather, I printed the designs out on stamps. These will then be pressed into the foam after it's heated up and leave behind an embossed surface. I've included the STLs for these stamps with the template. Warm the foam with the heat gun and firmly press the stamp into the surface and hold while the foam cools back down. I've used this technique when I made my Viking-inspired bracers, but never on something this large or with such a complex design, so we'll see how it turns out. I have to say, I'm really happy with the results. Even with the intricate design, the foam picked up all the details of the stamp, and when it's painted, it will really resemble embossed leather. The next couple steps are optional if you want, but I wanted to take these straps even further. So I'm using a leather stitching wheel to create stitching marks so it'll look like parts R and S are sewn onto parts P and Q. I'm pressing the wheel along the edges of R and S, and the wheel is leaving behind little pin pricks. This is a technique usually done with leather so you can evenly space out the stitching, and it allows for less resistance when the needle passes through the leather. But I found that techniques used in leather working can also really work well with foam. To make the stitching, I'm using crochet yarn. It doesn't need to be fancy because it's going to get painted, so I grabbed a ball from the thrift store for 50 cents. Using an upholstery needle, I'm going to sew through the pin pricks made with the stitching wheel. This will just add another level of detail to the shield to make it look even more like the screen used prop. I'm sewing this by hand and it'll take a minute, so it's steps like these where I turn on the TV and kick back until the process is finished. Usually when I'm watching something, I'm planning out another project, so it's an easy way to multitask without running like crazy. With them finished, you can see how it just adds more realistic detail. Part Q can get its 1/8 inch holes cut out of one end, and I'm not going to attach the straps until everything gets painted. So now it was time to apply Plasti Dip to everything. I sprayed 3 coats and let each coat dry for a half hour before applying the next. My reason for 3 was to make sure all the embossing and textures really got coated. After the Plasti Dip cured completely overnight, I mixed some brick red with some burnt umber and painted the wood texture on the rear of the shield. Then I remembered I wanted to airbrush the metal looking areas, so I switched gears and loaded the airbrush with some metallic silver. I'm airbrushing the metallic because I want to avoid any possible brush marks, and yes, I know, some is getting on the already painted wood, but luckily I had mixed up enough of the red color, so when the metallic is dry, I'll do some touch-ups. After the touch-ups, I take some burnt umber and brush streaks onto the wood texture. For both the wood and the leathers, we are going to build up layers of color to create depth and realism in the paint job, and these streaks will accentuate the wood grain. After the streaks are dry, I mix burnt sienna and raw umber together, thinned it with water, and brushed a layer over all the wood. It's looking very orange right now, but the thing to remember about acrylics is they will dry darker than they look when they're wet. While that wash is still wet, I mixed some black with a little bit of burnt umber and made a wash. This wash is then brushed into the wet paint around the edges of the wood and can be blended into the previous wet layer by simply pulling the black into the sienna like so. After that's all dry, it was time to work on the front. Straight up silver is too shiny for a shield like this, so to tone it down a little and add some slight texture, I'm pouncing the silver areas with some metallic tin. The metallic will keep the metal appearance, and the tin will add more dimension, making it look like a dusty steel. Then the wings and part E can be painted with some metallic gold. I've found that with metallic paints, especially gold, multiple coats are usually needed to obtain even coverage, otherwise the paint job can look a little streaky. Then to paint the iconic red leather on the front of the shield, I start by basing the area with the brick red. This is going to get multiple layers of color to again create dimension and depth, and while I work, I also pounce the painted areas with a crumbled up paper towel. This will remove brush marks and create a porous texture in the paint which resembles leather. After the brick red has dried, a magenta wash can be applied and dabbed just like the previous step. Then after that, some burgundy mixed with a tiny bit of black can be thinned with water and applied exactly the same. But this time, when dabbing with the paper towel, it'll expose some of the underpaint, causing the paint to not look as flat. Then a very thin black wash can be applied to the outer edge of the leather where the banding strip is. This needs to be very thin in order to create an ombre effect from the outer edge to the center of the shield. Once all the paint is dry, I give this red leather area a light spray with some glossy clear coat. This darkens the colors slightly, but it gives them a shine like smooth leather actually has. Again, I did a very light spray. If applied too thick, it'll begin to look like an applied layer and not as part of the leather. While the clear coat dried, I moved back to the straps. The last key element to work on was the buckle, which I 3D printed, and the SCL is included with the template. It is fully functional when printed, but it needs to look like the rest of the metal on the shield, so I sand the surface with some 400 grit sandpaper, and this will remove some of the visible print lines. Then the buckle is sprayed with 3 coats of a 2-in-1 filler and sandable primer to fill any remaining visible lines. Then it is sanded again with the 400 to even out the primer and just help smooth the surface to look like metal. Then it's completely sprayed with a glossy black, which works great as an undercolor for metallic paints. After the black is dry, it can be sprayed with a metallic silver. Then when the silver is dry, the buckle can be glued with CA glue into the 1/8 inch holes punched into part Q. On the underside, where the buckle's pegs stick through part Q, some of the part N rivets can be glued on so it covers the functionality and looks like authentic attachment. Now it's time to paint the straps. The 4mm foam can be based with some raw sienna, and this is looking very yellow now, but when I'm finished it'll look like raw aged leather. The embossed area can be based with the burgundy mixed with a little black. Since there's a lot of texture on this piece, I really push the paint into the texture to make sure all the areas are based. Then I pounce on some burnt umber with an old brush, and then dab with a paper towel to create the leather texture like on the shield. Then some thinned black can be applied in creases and where pieces meet, and dabbed as well. I also used the thin black to accentuate the embossing and the stitching. Once all that was dry, a burgundy wash was applied onto the embossed areas only. The buckle area is painted like the rest of the steel metallic areas, and when the straps were completely dry, the PR strap is looped through the bracket on the outer edge, and the QS strap with the buckle is looped through the bracket at the grip. The straps are glued onto themselves with superglue, and part and rivets are glued on as well. Then the PR strap can be fed through the buckle and secured like so. And with that, Boromir's shield is complete. I won't say this is the most complicated project I've ever undertook. I think that actually would be the life-size IG-12 droid, but it's definitely in the top 5. Not to mention all the techniques needed when it came to painting the various textures. I mean, this shield has it all. Wood, metal, leather. I have to say, I'm really happy with the results on this project, and I think it was definitely worth the time and energy. Let me know what you think of this project. I hope you enjoyed this build. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, and if you want to make one of these for your collection, I'll put a link to the template and the STLs in the below description. Again, if you liked it, please give it a thumbs up and comment, because activity will help get my channel seen. Feel free to share with all your friends and family, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't, and I'll catch you on the next one. Have a great day. And remember, if you are building any of my builds or using any of my templates, feel free and tag me at House of Props on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, because I would really like to see your fantastic work. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.